Hello, everybody. Welcome. Get good stuff. So I'm
Yeah,
totally get
and
that.
actually the golden because I'm gluten intolerant. So
Mm,
when the guys from NTX had me on their show, there's
yeah,
always a discussion that we have is the gluten free beers.
yeah.
Um, and that's this one is gluten reduced, so not good for everyone who's gluten free, but for me it doesn't bother me, which
Oh,
is really
okay.
nice. Nice
That's
to have
good.
a non-alky option to just chill and still tastes like beer. So
Yeah. I don't know that there's a lot of gluten-free ones that are an A style. So that's interesting. I'll have to look that
there,
one up.
yeah, there's not really, I don't think. There's
Yeah.
another one from Go Brewing that I tried once. And that one was actually pretty good too, but not all theirs are gluten free. Same with athletics, so you have to be
Yeah.
careful when you are picking them.
Yeah. You got to be a little more conscientious of what you drink, then, I suppose.
Yeah,
I unfortunately
exactly,
don't have that. But I
exactly.
am dealing with a little bit of post. I was at a beer festival in Wisconsin this past weekend, and I got a little bit of the stuffy nose, kind of that when you're around a lot of people you're not normally around thing. Not full
Yeah,
cold, so I'm doing a little bit of a hot toddy tonight. Usually this is my show
nice,
where I drink whiskey because I do a show on Friday nights where I drink beer, and this is my whiskey show. But so I am
cool.
technically having whiskey. I'm having some bourbon, but yeah. So
which
cheers to
which,
that.
which bourbon did you put in there?
It is a smaller batch. It's a queer owned one, and I have it over my desk over there. But
Cool,
like
cool,
Miram and something, Miram and Grace, I think is the name of it. But
cool.
just a little bit to flavor it. So, but yeah,
Nice.
yeah, it's whiskey. Yeah, it's whiskey, Daddy. So, let's talk a bit about jazz, man. Like again, it is not a
Yeah.
style of music I listen to a lot of. Once in a while, I feel like it's good driving music for me. Like
Hmm.
when I listen to it, that's generally when I'm doing it, or maybe if I'm doing something where it's uh, like for me, if I'm doing stuff around the house or something like that, but it's kind of like something that just really good. So for me, for those sort of elements. So tell me a little bit, your background, how you got into jazz, like
Hmm.
what some of your inspirations, or uh, like people that inspired you to get into it. Let's hear a little bit
Yeah,
about
sure. So for me, it wasn't necessarily like a very conscious decision to get into it. It just kind of happened that when I first started playing bass, which is my primary instrument, I play electric bass and upright bass, primarily upright these days. Living in New York and working the jazz scene, there's a high demand for, um, upright bass players. It's
that.
kind of what we do, and it kind of just so happened that every private teacher that I had was more influenced by jazz players and was teaching me more kind of like jazz theory and more about the ability to learn how to improvise,
Mm,
you know, which is really what jazz is. I mean, it's such a broad, I'm glad that we're talking about the idea of how there's subgenres and all that, because it's such a broad term that can mean so much to so many different people, but ultimately it's a Black American art form that was created in the US from the conditions that were here, whether it was the enslaved folks that took the blues and gospel music, and then in New Orleans we see a mix of the Creole people taking in European influences that they had, and then you have this like big melting pot of different influences between African cultures, Latin American cultures, European cultures, and music traditions, and they all kind of blend together. And through time, it created this music that was initially a dance music, that eventually evolved into many, many other things. Um, but yeah, so I say all that to say that, when I first started, obviously I didn't know any of that stuff.
mm,
I just loved music, and I came from it from a classic rock perspective first, in a grunge kind of thing. I was really
mm,
into Nirvana, Pearl Jam, the Gin Blossoms, all those bands. And you know, because I was studying more jazz theory with like my teachers and kind of more jazz tunes,
Mm,
I started to get more hip to that music. And at this time, I was only playing electric bass. So, and I had a magazine. It was a great magazine that I got as a gift from my parents. A subscription, year subscription, a bass player magazine, and I would read that thing front to back because I've always been a pretty voracious reader.
mm,
And uh, you know, there a few names would keep popping up from influences, as influences of these rock bass players that I liked, that I was learning about, and I always read about the jazz guys too, even in there, even though I had no idea who they were, And the influences, the two that always popped up was number one, Jaco Pastorius was a huge name. And number two was a bass player by the name of Ray Brown, upright bassist. Um, and I remember going to the CD store, with my folks, and just randomly walking in the jazz aisle, which I didn't even know that's what it was. And I see Jaco Pastorius' solo album sitting in the rack. And I was like, that's the dude, you know, that's the guy I
mm.
keep reading about. And, uh, I got the record, and minute we got in the car to drive home with my folks, I was like, can we put it on? Can we put it on? And to this day, I still have that same reaction when I listen to that record. It just blew my mind. Completely blew my mind. I'd never heard the bass ever sound like that before, you know. And Jaco really did a lot for the instrument, for the electric bass in particular. He changed kind of the way that it was played. You know, now the bass was not just relegated to, being kind of in the back of the band and kind of more in the pocket and felt more than heard. Jocko was one of the first bass players to really put it up front and be like, no, you're going to listen to the bass, and he just totally changed the game. A lot of bass players post Jocko had no other choice other than to come out of Jocko. He was the dude. Prior to him, it was James Jamerson of Motown, a guy that you've heard a zillion times, on recordings. He was one of Jocko's influences, James Jamerson and Ray Brown. They were the
Mm.
two biggest. And Jocko said Charlie Parker and Bach. Those were the guys that he studied the most. When
And
you hear him, you hear all that stuff, and it's really, really deep. Um, and I listened to a lot of Jocko, a lot of Weather Report, which was the band that he played with primarily. So my first forays into jazz actually were through jazz fusion. The stuff that was kind of happening in the 70s, in the 80s, more so than the stuff that I now play, which is more straight ahead jazz, and kind of coming from a more, I really hate to say traditional perspective, because in my opinion there's nothing traditional about it, but kind of more in that, I guess, style, uh
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, okay. Yeah, it all those folks I've never heard of. So
Yeah.
this is as a part of the reason I do this show. So yeah, I do a lot of stuff that's just for me because I'm the one hosting it. But like if I can have folks on that I like can give me like insight into something that I don't know a lot about, that's really what I get really interested because
Yeah.
my daughter's fiance, he plays a lot of jazz and like he man, he plays like four different instruments and like
Yeah.
and it's just one of those things where I feel like to me it seems like a lot of jazz musicians are really able to play a multitude of instruments. It feels like that to me. Is that something that you find true? You just mentioned the upright bass and the bass, like the electric
Hmm.
bass. Are there other things you play as well?
I play a little bit of piano, like most jazz artists should probably do if they don't. Um, and that's mainly just because the piano, just as a tool to write and to hear music, is extremely helpful. Because if you think about the piano like an orchestra, you can have 10 different instruments, you know,
Oh, okay.
at your disposal. And the problem with the bass and, you know, saxophone, trumpet, like instruments that don't require all 10 fingers, or that you can really even play chords with. Even in guitar has this issue that it has to deal with at times. Because on guitar, you can only really finger, about 5 notes at a time. Piano, you got double that. It's 5 notes at most. Most jazz guitarists are only making chords usually with between 2 and 4 notes.
Hmm.
So um, with the piano, you can see and you can hear everything at your fingertips. So having a nice basic um, command over, just being able to like read a lead sheet, which is just a piece of music that has the melody and the chord changes, just to be able to kind of sit down and like play the melody in one hand and basic chords in the left is so useful in developing your ears so you can just hear more things and get used to like hearing two things at once as opposed to one note at a time, or the most I could play on the bass really is two, but most of the time it's one at a time. So
Yeah.
um it's I find especially a lot of like really great jazz musicians have a, I wouldn't say a great knowledge of the keyboard in terms of like facility and all that, but can kind of get around it a little, enough to like write music and to be able to hear what they're writing, and
Mm.
um, to be able to hear what the chords sound like. It's kind of like the mother, instrument to be able to just do anything really, whether it's write music or understand how melody and harmony kind of works together. It's yeah. So I play a little piano, not well. I couldn't like sit down and play you a tune necessarily, and play in good time or whatever. But I do majority of my composing on piano, just so I can hear how everything is working together, and hear different options. A big part of what a jazz musician does, especially a jazz composer, is like you accumulate all this knowledge of music theory, of like solos that you learn, and we call it vocabulary, the stuff that came before you. You're learning how to speak the language of jazz, and how to improvise, essentially, how to compose music on the spot, because that's what great jazz musicians are doing. Very, very little of what you hear is actually written down. It's usually when I teach this, because I do a lot of teaching, both to musicians and non-musicians. If you listen to the average jazz song, the only part that is really composed is what you hear in the beginning, 30 seconds to minute, and what you hear in the end, 30 seconds to minute. And that's what we call the melody, where if there was a singer, it'd be the part that they would be singing. When there isn't a singer, it's usually a horn player that takes over that role, unless it's a piano trio, and then the pianist would take over that role. But everything in the middle is improvised based off a structure. The composer does create the structure as well, for the most part, and those structures can kind of change. Um, they create the structure, and we take solos and improvise over that structure. Uh, but as we're doing that, we're also communicating with each other, non-verbally most of the time. Usually only verbally if something goes wrong, and then it's like, oh, this is where we're at. But most of the time it's non-verbally, uh, and that's the fun of it, is that like, you're making choices, every millisecond, as to what note you want to pick, and what note you think is going to sound good. Sometimes you play something intentionally antagonistic for the soloist to listen to and then react. So now you're having a real conversation, with each other,
Oh, okay.
and that's the beauty of the music, is that like I could play. I mean, I just did this actually. I just finished a run of shows at Dizzy's Club in New York, Jazz at Lincoln Center, and we played almost the same set every night, and it's totally completely different. You know, you know, we play the structure that I created and the melody at the beginning and at the end of the song, but it's fair game for pretty much anything to happen in the middle. Especially with my band because we like to kind of poke at each other and figure out, have some fun.
Yeah.
Sometimes playing something that we know is intentionally the exact wrong thing to play at the time, but just to see how it's going to cause a reaction in the group and how that can take us into other directions, searching essentially. And it often happens. I play the same set two times in a row at other venues, when you have to do multiple sets, or, a lot of the time they turn house, sometimes they don't. But, when you do that, it's amazing to me still about this music that each set can be so completely different, and the directions that a band can take, can be so completely different and creative. And to me, that's the beauty of it. And the greatest jazz masters, that's what they've done for forever,
Mm.
is, it's not like classical music in the sense where it's written, and everything is kind of dictated as to how it's going to be played. you know I mean, that's the beauty of classical music is as well, is that in that case the composer literally wrote everything that they wanted to be played and how they wanted it to be played, you know uh and then it's the interpretation of that composer's work, that makes it unique to the player, but the work doesn't change. Then every note is going to be the same regardless if you hear the Berlin Philharmonic play it or the London Symphony play it. All the written stuff is the same.
So,
So,
sorry to interrupt.
no, absolutely not.
I have something I want to ask, and then we have a question. Well, a question for you that from the folks watching. So
Sure.
basically, you made the comparison of like when you're on the stage and you're kind of improvising, and you called it a conversation.
Hmm.
So is that what you're doing? Is you're really conversing with the instruments to not to talk to each other, maybe not that, maybe, or communicate with the audience? Like, is that what that
Yeah.
is? Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah. Essentially, if you think of like everything that we play, take away the idea of notes and theory and all that, and just get back to language, right? The way we speak. We speak in phrases and sentences, right? And especially in like a play, there's dialogue that's written. You know, Jazz is kind of more like a sketch comedy show, right? Where you have a topic, we can say that the topic is the tune, the tune that I wrote, the structure, we'll call it the structure. That's like our prompt, you know.
Hmm.
But what happens in there is fair game. So if I say a phrase to you, and you do the thing you're supposed to do in sketch comedy, which is say yes to everything, you're
Yeah.
never supposed to say no. You're supposed to run with what people give you, you know, and it's very much jazz like in that environment because that's exactly kind of what we're doing. I'm going to say a phrase, and somebody's going to respond with something, you know, and then within that, there's also, uh, we can call them loosely roles, right? So the bass has its role, the drums have their role, piano has its role. Everybody's role is to communicate with each other, even within those roles, right? So
Right.
the drummer is going to keep time and you know, do what we call color the tune. He's going to throw things in there that create a different kind of atmosphere, especially when there's multiple soloists. The way he plays for one person, if he's a good drummer, he's going to play differently for the next soloist to create a different texture, a different environment so that it's interesting for the audience. You know, the
Yeah.
bass's job, my job in the band at first is to like kind of hold everything together to be the glue between the pianist and the drums, the kind of the heartbeat, so to speak, of the band. But then I have freedom too because if you know uh I can choose to pick different notes that take the band in a different direction, especially after we've been going for a little bit, and the foundation is already set, you know.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
sure does, sure does. And
Yeah.
so I'll have questions regarding all that melody about something else in a minute, but I wanted to get this one. So our friend Zach said to get your take on Polyplus. Do you know of them? Because I have not heard of them.
Polyplus. I gotta check them out, man. I don't. I'm not super familiar. Thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah, Zach is
Yeah.
like he has a pretty extensive vinyl collection. Uh,
Cool.
so so he has a really eclectic taste too. So he has like a huge like video game vinyl record collection, like video game
Oh shoot.
soundtracks. So he's a great resource for those kind of
I mean,
things.
there's some great composers for video games. That's like a real like thing, like a real career that,
Hmm.
I know some musicians, I know one in particular. I'm not super tight with him, but we're more of like acquaintances, but he moved to Japan to do that full time, to work on video games and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So he said,
Japanese jazz, yeah.
yeah. So he said also Soil and Pimp Sessions. What a name.
Wow, I gotta write those down, make sure I check them out. 'Cause
Yeah.
I know there's some good stuff in there for sure.
Yeah.
In the
So
Japanese jazz scene, that's like also a thing, that you see in New York, going back to the melting pot idea is that, jazz originally started traveling the world because musicians from the States started touring as, ambassadors kind of, like, I think Louis Armstrong did the first ever, like jazz ambassador tour in the 40s or 50s or something,
mm,
where he was actually like, um, you know, it was a government sponsored tour to get, American music over there, and then from that, uh, obviously it's kept happening. The jazz scene is worldwide now, but a lot of that is because of the first, musicians from here kind of moving over there, uh, and touring, but also living. There was a big migration of musicians in the '60s that moved to Europe to escape, the racism and shit that was happening in the U.S.
that's still happening in the U.S.,
Still
but
happening. It's not done.
yeah.
Um, but there was a big migration of cats that moved over there and toured over there a lot. Dexter Gordon lived in Copenhagen for a really long time. Sidney Bechet moved to Paris, and was doing stuff there. Yeah, there was so much of it happening, um, that, yeah, especially in Paris, there was like a big Parisian jazz scene that still exists. I mean, Paris, especially for straight ahead jazz, still has a huge jazz scene there, of great players. Japan, we were on the topic of Japan, but Japan's got a huge jazz scene, many of whom, move to the States to study. Some stay, some, go back and uh, you know, play and teach what they learned. And uh, yeah, it's such a worldwide thing now that also because of that, it takes the influences from those musics and those cultures into, what we hear here. So now it's an even bigger, um, pool of influences that make up the scene essentially.
Mhm. Yeah. So this is going to be a personal part of this to me. So the reason that I do sometimes listen to jazz is I like instrumental stuff for two reasons. One, because I like to see how stuff is arranged or
Hmm.
hear how but the other part is I am partially deaf. So like when I'm listening to music, melody and stuff like that actually is what I hear most.
Mm,
I lyrics are lost on me about 50% of the time.
gotcha.
So if I'm listening to something that's just musical instruments playing and that kind of is something that's a little more in my wheelhouse. Like
Hmm.
for instance, I was when I was younger, I listened to a lot of house music. that's can be pretty derivative depending on the style of house you're listening to. But
Hmm.
it's there's some singing, but this generally speaking, the people who are singing in house have huge voices, like huge, strong, present voices where I can actually hear some of it.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's largely beats and melodies and rhythm and all that, and that's where like my listening experience really lives. So it's something
yeah.
where when Tony and Jerry talked to you about it, and I listened to that. I was like, I asked him, "Hey, can I talk? Do you think you could email him from my part? Because this is where I can learn." So,
Yeah. Oh, I
so
appreciate you reaching out, man. This is, I'm happy. I'm always happy to talk about music. It's, can't shut me up about it usually. So,
so speaking of music, why don't we dip into this is basically what I understand is your latest release.
hmm.
I'm going to put it up here if it comes up.
Yeah,
There we
that's
go.
it.
People, people and places. So why don't you talk a little bit about this album here? I know I'm using Spotify, which boo Spotify, but this is what I could display it as.
I mean, these days I'm on like all three, Tidal, Apple, and Spotify. I keep Spotify because that's what most of my students tend to use. So,
Mm-hmm.
so when I'm teaching, it's just easier just to come up with a playlist and just share it with them
Mm-hmm.
there. YouTube actually is really good for that too. Um, but yeah, so People and Places is a collection of tunes that I kind of wrote. I didn't write all of them actually. There's two that I didn't write. But it's a collection of tunes, about essentially just what it is, people and places, whether it was a real place or an imagined one, um, and real people that were and are important to me. Um, for instance, 280 Star Street, the dojo. That's a really special one because one of my hobbies, besides, I mean, my only hobby actually that I have, um, is training Muay Thai martial arts. I've been doing that for um, about 8 to 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
something in that range. Taking breaks kind of in between at times just because of life.
Yeah.
But so that's the actual address of the gym that I was training at, and I wanted to write a tune about it because it was the one thing that kind of when I was going through a really sort of dark era, um, I needed an outlet, and going to the gym and training for me became that outlet. And I found a really good home at the second gym that I trained at, which is the dojo, 280 Star Street. Although now they moved. They moved like 6 months after this song released. So now it's just a random spot in Bushwick, Brooklyn.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a big one. Um, the rest of the tunes, like Streets of Palermo, came from trying to capture the vibe of um, you know, Palermo, Sicily when I went to visit there. It had this kind of energy that was both like ominous and really beautiful at the same time. And I tried to capture that in the different sections of the tune. Um, New America was a composition written by my sax player, Nick Biello, who's someone I work quite a lot with and have recorded extensively with on his recordings as well. He's one of my very, very good friends. And he wrote this tune, and it's kind of inspired by his, wanting of people to be able to talk to each other again. Be able to have
Okay.
opposing views, but still like find some middle ground as to what is, um, just to be like cordial and like actually have a conversation with each other without having it turn into a screaming match. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to scream about, for sure these days, but um, I think that's really important that people not lose the ability to just listen to each other's opinions first before immediately categorizing something as whatever, Um,
Yeah,
oh,
baby.
thank
What's
you,
that?
man. Thank you. Hope you enjoy it.
Yeah.
Uh, t- t-
Sax on West Coast time. So
cool, cool. Tell Us of Your Beloved. That's another one. That was written actually by the wonderful vocalist in my band, Venetia Gold. Um, and she was gracious enough to let us record that because it's been in the book for the band actually for quite some time now. And it just, the vibe on that tune really, really just fit the style of music that we kind of are playing and whatnot. So, um, yeah, I don't know if you want me to go through all of them, but that's
it's your album. Let's talk about whatever you
uh,
like.
Late Night Walk in Madrid. That's a funny one. Um, I was just finishing a tour in Madrid, and actually that tour I think we went all through the north of Spain. It was with this great guitar player Sean Clappus, who's another really good friend of mine who ended up moving out to Spain um, right before COVID,
No,
and he put this tour together, and it was my first time going. I think the tour actually was. I can't remember if it was. I think it was before COVID because I did one before and one after, but I actually can't remember which one it was that I wrote this tune.
yeah,
Uh, but the tour was amazing, and it was our last night. We just finished the gig. We met a bunch of new friends at the gig that ended up coming to have dinner with us after the gig, and it was just one of those very like you know kind of joyous experiences of just being on the road, and it was the last night. Drank some of the best wine I've ever drank in my life. Had some of the best food I ever had, like on that tour especially. It was our last meal ended up being probably the greatest one that we had, which is totally unintentional because we had been looking for somewhere to eat pretty late. And if, for your listeners, I don't know if they know, but the Spanish people eat really late. So
yes, they do.
usually it's not too hard to do, but for whatever reason this night, maybe it was just that late. I can't remember. But it was really hard, and we found this place, and they were open, and they saw that we were musicians, and they just, they rolled out the red carpet, and it was just really, really amazing. So I ended up walking back to the hotel, which was about 45 minutes of a walk, pretty buzzed from the wine. And this melody of that tune just kind of came into my head, and I recorded it in the voice memo and turned it into a full-fledged tune when I got back to the States. So that's how that one kind of came about. Your Love Is Home, that one was a tune that I wrote for my wife, you know, uh, but it's also, you know, I like to write tunes that have sort of multiple meanings. Um, and that one's just about just a place that you consider home, whether it's a person or uh, excuse the pun, whether it's a person or a place, you know, um, we all deserve, I think, to have that spot that reminds us of home, that we feel safe in, that we immediately can get there and just kind of like let our guard down and just be ourselves. So uh, that's kind of what that tune is geared towards and about. Um, The Mind's Eye, that's another one that's kind of like a bit more of a uh thank you, Jerry. My man. Good to see you. So Mind's Eye, that one, that one is kind of about the a place that we spend most of our time, which is in our own heads, we tend to want to get out of that as much as we can, but it's kind of inevitable. And as an artist, as a musician, composer, the beautiful thing about writing and creating, to me, has always been the ability to express oneself. And to do that, I do have to spend a certain amount of time in my own head, reflecting on experiences and kind of looking through my own looking glass, if that makes sense. Um, and sometimes it's funny, it's I've been having these conversations and with other musicians about like writing because I'm trying to write even more now than I ever have. Um, uh, and just be in the habit of doing it on the daily, and sometimes you write a tune and you don't know what it's going to be about until it's done, and then sometimes, you're crafting this tune and, you know, a, a, a a title comes and then it helps you finish the tune, you know. And other times it's like the title is already written and you're writing to that inspiration, but it's always like, if you think about it like sculpture, it's like, the piece of staff paper or whether it's digital or real, is the block of, marble.
Yeah,
And you just have to start kind of getting to it and writing things down. Eventually it kind of decides what it wants to be, you know. Um,
yeah. I feel like so I do some writing, and I get that whole concept where like sometimes it's a thought, sometimes it's an idea, sometimes it's a character, sometimes it's a title. It's just all these different elements can be like the genesis of something really creative, and it can
yeah,
be any time, right? And then other times it's much harder to get to, like you know.
totally.
And
You
your
know,
idea
and
of like writing every day is like that's an ambition I have. I rarely do it because
mhm,
life and all that. But yeah, I think if
yeah,
you write, you're flexing that creative muscle. So
and
kudos to
that's
you for
that's
doing that more than me.
that's I mean that's what it is though, and you know, uh, lately when I've been writing, I've been trying to do it away from the instrument entirely. Just kind of exploring ideas. Well, I should say it's probably 70-30. You know, like when we go on this trip to Portugal coming up, I'm not taking. I usually take my electric bass to be able to, play a little and keep my fingers active. I'm not doing that so much this time. I'm taking my computer and I'm taking my little digital MIDI keyboard to try to explore some different writing options. And I always take some actual real staff paper too to just jot ideas down actually like physically, with pencil and paper.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, that's something, I just finished grad school in May. I went back to school to Manhattan School of Music for is a performance degree to get my master's. But I was writing so much during that program that it was something that I found really valuable in even furthering my playing, my ability to play the bass. Yeah, that's funny. Um, thank you, Jerry. But yeah, and that's something also I'm becoming a little more comfortable with just being okay with now is, I think I always was more of a visual learner, and learn things better by actually physically writing it out in my own hand and seeing it, you know.
yeah,
Um, and that's actually not always the most popular opinion amongst musicians,
mm,
when you're trying to learn something, sometimes people are like, "Oh no, man, you got to memorize it. It's got to be like, you know, you can't write it until you have it already memorized." And I'm like, I don't know. I tell my students the most important thing is doing the work.
yeah,
Doesn't matter how you get to it, just do the work. You know what you're supposed to do. Just do it. Take the time. Doesn't have to be a lot, you know. Could be just 10 minutes a day of dedicated focused time on one thing can do really miraculous things over the course of a month or 6 months or 3 months, you know. Um, yeah, so yeah, that's kind of where the writing stuff has been coming from lately is just not wanting to ditch the habit of doing it because I was doing it pretty much every day for 2 years,
yeah,
Um, and it's great. I obviously didn't use everything that I wrote. Some of it is total trash that I'm never gonna look at again. But then some of
yeah,
it was stuff, that actually for these recent gigs that I've had with my band, I revisited and I edited some of the stuff, to be more of what I'm actually hearing as opposed to just trying to make the deadline. And yes, I'm really happy with some of the new stuff that eventually I'm looking to get back in the studio in October to do the next record. So um some of that music will likely be on it for sure.
Nice. That's excellent because obviously new music is always good. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just putting stuff out too, that's like for for an up and coming, independent artist, you know, uh these days it's just keeping your name kind of in circulation, and because there's not a lot of like major labels that are doing these big deals for jazz artists in particular, and you know there are labels that are doing good work. I mean, I'm on a label that does really great work, but most of it is still like they're not paying me to make the records, they're just helping me put it out.
yeah.
It's and I love that because I get to keep so much of my own creative uh
Gives you
rights
autonomy.
to my music, and you know um I think it's great. It's just having good people in your corner to get the word out and ease some of that challenge,
Sure.
is helpful. But the days of like A&R and like making big, you know, there's it's kind of sort of over in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I feel like your independent labels are where it's at if you want to get some really interesting and new music, as opposed to like you're gonna get your big labels that put out your Taylor Swifts and all that jazz for sure.
Yeah.
But those folks are looking for big buck things. They're not looking for independent creative things. They're looking for things that will sell and sell a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all
So
that's cool. That's cool too. I got no problem with that either, but
me either.
it's just, in the jazz and classical genres, I think they're like maybe, the last time I looked it up, I think it was like the extreme 1.1% of the spectrum, like,
Right.
you know, and then you got, you know, country, pop, and gospel, which are like the big chunks of what is getting listened to these days. So,
Yeah.
and that's, yeah, it's cool. It's fine.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit here. Let's talk about styles of jazz because, like every genre, there is got to be a host of different genres within jazz itself. I mean, for instance, you mentioned straight away jazz, I think, or straight ahead jazz.
Straight ahead. Yeah.
So why don't you start there and then let's branch out? What else comes into the fold of different styles?
So, yeah. Um, Straight ahead is, yeah, it's kind of a interesting uh thing to put into words. So we have this big label of jazz, which I think is more fitting to call it, improvised music, and in particular, Black American improvised music or Black American classical music. So when you're talking about like straight ahead jazz, we're kind of talking about the styles that came post what we call trad jazz. So post like New Orleans stuff that like Louis Armstrong was playing, and Sidney Bechet and those guys, you know, and kind of more of the stuff that was made famous and well known by people like Charlie Parker and Miles Davis in the 40s to late 60s, we could say. There's subgenres even in that, but
Yeah.
um, what categorizes that a lot of the time is, this the swing feel, which drummer is on the ride cymbal, da 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 da. The bass
Hmm.
player is walking the bass, ba-dum, dum, 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 dum,
Hmm.
and the piano player is kind of like, comping rhythmically and um, whatnot. But the stays home and drinks raw milk.
Never mind. He's a joke machine too.
I mean, I love trad. It's not what I play personally, but I love to listen to the real guys that play it. You know, um, when I went and visited New Orleans, I went to what's the name of that hall? I should know this.
Is it on Frenchman Street?
No, it's it'll come to me. I lost my train of thought, but the guys that are playing at that particular place been doing that music for, you know, uh, the music that music there for probably over 100 years. You know,
Preservation Hall by chance?
Preservation Hall. That's it. Yeah, yeah. Preservation Hall. If you ever go to New Orleans, is well worth the trip to really like see that music played on the highest level. Because it's still improvised. It's still very much. You know, I mean, that's where the tradition of the music kind of started. Then it went into like what we're calling straight ahead jazz now, which is sort of the stuff that Miles and Coltrane and Charlie Parker were playing. Um, you know, you have bebop as a subcategory of that that led into post bop, hard bop, you know, which eventually led into some of the more avant-garde stuff, you know, and um, uh, that eventually would lead into some of the electronic stuff, jazz fusion, and you know where we're at now really is like uh, to me many different offshoots of the avant-garde and of you know fusion and straight ahead. You know, it's like it's kind of those three things depending on who you're listening to because there are so many different offshoots. But those are like the three kind of main styles I feel like or main subcategories that are being played now and that people are writing now. But also, there's so many different influences that came into the music too. You know, because of people from all over loving the music and wanting to learn how to play it and taking their own cultures and uh, musical environments to the music. You know,
Mhm.
so you know it's hard to even categorize what these subgenres would be called now because it's so uh, so mixed in, so blended. You know, one of the things you see a lot now is, you know, I like to call it jazz adjacent music. You know, it's music that is taking a lot of influences of jazz and uh, jazz harmony and you know rhythmic elements, but putting them in a bit more of like a uh, you know pop or R&B kind of like sensibility. You know,
Yeah,
which
a
I
lot
think
of
is great. You know, I love that stuff. I mean, you have you know artists, for example, like Leon Thomas. You know, is a guy that you know I just saw him at Newport Jazz Fest. Uh, was it last week? I think it was last weekend. Yeah,
mm,
you know, and it was great. You know, Leon Thomas, guy Jordan Rakai, who's great. That my wife actually hit me to. Um, you know, I mean, even an artist like D'Angelo, right? That's someone that everyone knows. You know, he was working right besides jazz musicians and jazz artists. He was one himself, you know, with the way that he wrote and the way that he, you know, arranged and orchestrated music. So, you know, the term is so like it's such a blanket term that can mean so much, you know.
yeah. There's also like this subset of like hip hop where it's like folks who infuse like jazz into their music, like your Tribe Called Quest and De La Souls and all that stuff, and
Totally.
like jazz beats into it, which was at the time was super inventive and cool because it was nothing like something hip hop had done before. But it just shows that jazz has influence that goes across a whole plethora of genres that aren't just jazz.
Totally. I mean, when you're talking about the history of American music just in general, everything can be traced back to the blues, to early gospel music, uh, jazz, you know, and what would become jazz, you know, and, you know, basically like, you know, folk music, you know, which to me, folk music is just, an offshoot really of blues and gospel music. So, um, you have a lot of different influences, you know, or I should say, there's a lot of subcategories of this main thing, but the roots of the music are always going to be the same, you know,
Yeah.
and even rock, like, rock was taking so much from the early blues artists, the Delta blues artists, and and the jazz guys too. I mean, it's uh so I played a gig with this was many years ago, but one of the drummers of the Allman Brothers, JMO, and JMO, his biggest influences were Jimmy Cobb and Elvin Jones, two of the greatest jazz drummers of all time.
Mm.
You know, John Bonham, drummer for Led Zeppelin, was quoted as saying Elvin Jones was his hero. That was who he wanted to sound like. You know, and once again, one of the greatest jazz drummers of all time. You know, Neil Peart
Yeah.
of
I was just
Rush
going to mention him.
he was checking out all those guys.
Yeah.
Um, the list goes on. It goes on and on. You know, Lenny White from Earth, Wind and Fire. You know, uh, no one would that knows him as the drummer Earth, Wind and Fire would maybe investigate further, but Lenny is like one of the greatest jazz drummers who's still alive, still like killing it to this
Still kicking.
day.
Yeah.
And recording with people, and making his own records, and it's amazing how when you start digging into the history, a little bit of American music, even just an artist that you like learning who they liked, their influences were, you can trace the lineage all the way back, you
Yeah.
know, and it's to me that's the one of the most beautiful things about, jazz as an art form, um, but also just as, sort of like a language, that, we can all listen to, or if you play an instrument, you can learn, you know, because if you keep tracing things back, you're gonna go back to the blues, and to the early jazz artists.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. You know,
Yeah, but it feels like that's it. Everything kind of gets a start from there. Kind of them the building blocks of it. So yeah.
totally. I mean, even someone like Quincy Jones, for instance.
Mm.
This was a dude who was one of the main arrangers in the Count Basie Orchestra. You know, and then he in his lifetime, because we just lost him fairly recently, but in his lifetime he was producing artists like Jacob Collier, you know Michael Jackson, you know uh you know I mean, you name him, and he was there, writing music for the Wiz, and like,
Yeah.
you know he did
What a life.
so much in his career, and it's all tied to the beginning his beginnings with Count Basie, you know
Yeah.
and writing for Sinatra, so it was like,
Goodness. Yeah.
it's amazing, man,
Yeah.
that stuff pumps me up.
Yeah. For sure. So, well, before we wrap this up, I actually wanted to ask you. This was a question I wanted to ask you: is if you were going to what are some of your favorite jazz groups slash musicians that you would recommend? Hey, give these folks a listen because I like them for what, and it could be whatever reason. Just somebody you like, or you like the bassist, or whatever. Just give us some folks we should check out the jazz.
Yeah, I mean, man, there's so much.
I'm sure there
um
is, but
so I'll give my top ones, like kind of the reason, the guys that really got me into the music. Um, First, obviously, to me, it should be required listening for everyone. Um, just from an educational perspective. But Miles Davis, so what? Or sorry, Miles Davis, kind of blue is the record. Um, that's like, you know, Desert Island. So
album.
so important for the history of jazz music, but all of American music, that record. So that would be number one. Number two would be, this is a personal preference, but he's the reason I play the upright bass. Uh, there's a record called the Red Hot Ray Brown Trio. Ray Brown is the bassist. Um, there's a bunch. I mean, any Ray Brown trio is going to be great. Um, but he's really a dude to check out for just like some of the most like bluesy, earthy, just incredible feeling jazz. Um, first time I heard him, I was like, that's what I want to do, and it was because like it's his bass sound was so earthy, so natural that it kind of reminded me of like when you see a massive like oak tree. If that oak tree had like a sound, that to me
Oh,
is Ray. That's Ray. Um, John Coltrane, a record called Crescent, is one of my favorites. I always tend to go back to. Um, Another one, A Love Supreme. That's a really famous one, um, of Coltrane's. Um, for later stuff, there's a Weather Report record called Heavy Weather. You know, that features Jaco Pastorius on electric bass. That was when Jaco was very young. He got the gig with Weather Report and kind of changed the way that the bass was played, by the things that he played on that record and his solo record, which is just entitled Jaco Pastorius.
oh,
Jacopastoris, I think is how it's
okay.
spelled. Yeah. Um, yeah, but that's some of the most brilliant bass playing probably of all time. Uh, and then, for the trad stuff, because I've actually been going back and listening to a lot of that stuff to further my own knowledge of it. Um, and to also trace the lineage for my own uh for my own uh knowledge or whatever of the people who influenced the people who influenced the people that I like.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So uh the Louis Armstrong Hot Fives and Hot Sevens recordings are amazing. If you want to check out more of that stuff. I also really like a lot of Artie Shaw's uh uh playing. Artie was an incredible clarinet player, and he had this really woody song. Yo, what's up, Tony?
Yeah.
Oh man. So Artie Shaw, you know, a lot of his things now are on like these like compilation or essentials records that they kind of come out with. So I can't really give you one offhand to check out, but yeah, I really enjoy listening to Artie's playing. Um, and I mean, I can't. Fearless Flyers. Oh yeah, I'll say it's another one. I've heard the name, but I'm not really super familiar with that. Actually,
Yeah.
Zach. I'll check them out and let you know though for sure.
Hey, so
Um,
Zach's always good for some suggestions like that. So
yeah, Charlie Parker is another one though that if I didn't mention him, I would leave this conversation and be like, oh shoot,
yeah,
it would I would have been bummed.
yeah.
But I
You
mean,
just forget it.
Bird, his nickname was Bird. Uh, but Charlie Parker really changed, you know, jazz music and all of American music, you know, because anything that came after him was influenced by him. He was the equivalent of like a Bach or a Stravinsky, um, you know, in uh, in the 30s and the 40s. He died really young. I think he was only like 37
Oh
or
man.
something. Um, but yeah, he influenced pretty much every jazz musician that came after him, in some regard.
Awesome.
So that's a big one for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. Well, Alex, I want to say thanks again for popping on the show and dropping some knowledge here on jazz. I'm looking forward to kind of digging into this. I'll be listening to the people and places on my commute into work tomorrow just to start there.
Yeah, man.
Uh,
Let me know what you think.
oh, okay. One more question. Sorry.
Sure.
I think he's talking about Thelonious Monk.
Oh no, I mean, it's Monk was a complicated character, uh, who I think these days would have been diagnosed with some type of mental condition.
Yeah.
But back in the days, you know,
Nobody did
unfortunately
that.
they weren't really hip enough.
Yeah.
But
Well,
Monk, I'm glad he mentioned Monk because he falls into that same category as Charlie Parker, as someone who changed the face of all the music that came after jazz and other you know genres as well. Just he was such a unique character and very complicated in a lot of ways because of the mental kind of stuff.
yeah.
But yeah, yeah, he is very another one very well worth listening to. Um, for that, I'd highly recommend Monk live at the Five Spot. That's a really great record. There's a collection, I think, of performances that he had like something like I don't know if it was like a years long run at that club
Wow.
or if it was like 6 months or something. But he had a long time there with his band working on his music and um is really well worth the listen because that shit is some of the most amazing playing.
Yep. Like I said, thanks. Oh, he's going to
Thanks,
drive home
Zach.
and listen. Yeah. So anyway, again, so sorry we got sidetracked before the end here, but that's okay.
It's
Uh,
okay, man. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So again, thanks Alex for popping on here and talking jazz. Looking forward to listening to some more and learning more. I really appreciate it. So thank you for
My
doing that.
pleasure, man. Thanks
Yeah,
for having me on. And if any of your listeners want to follow, give me a follow. It's pretty much everything on social media at Alex Tremblay Music.
yeah,
Um, yep.
yeah. So follow him there. So before we go next month on September 4th, hold on, I did have the date, and now of course I'm forgetting. September 8th is going to be Nolan Fest. So basically, my two of my friends, Victor Aragon and Aaron Softway, are going to come on, and we're going to rank all of the Christopher Nolan movies. So I have started
Cool.
that endeavor of watching all 12 of his movies, which is that's not a small endeavor because his movies are rarely short. So that'll be again September 8th. And again, Alex, thanks again for popping on, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you, man.
Yep. Cheers, everybody.